Apartheid in Israel. Human Rights Watch calls the domination of Palestinians a crime against humanity. Israel rejects this and has ignored similar allegations before. So, can anything be done to hold Israeli leaders accountable? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. The term apartheid was first used in South Africa to describe the systematic separation and oppression of people based on their race. It's a crime against humanity. Human Rights Watch says that's exactly what's happening in Israel. It accuses the government of enforcing policies to maintain its dominance over Palestinians. Israel has dismissed similar accusations before and is calling the latest report a piece of propaganda. But Palestinian leaders say it's a solid account of atrocities, adding it's time for international action. We'll bring in our guests in a moment. First, this report by Harry Fawcett in occupied East Jerusalem.
Anti-Palestinian racism was on show in Jerusalem last week, with hundreds of Israeli far-right activists chanting "Death to Arabs." The far-right, thanks to an electoral alliance sponsored by the Prime Minister, now has a foothold inside Parliament. But in its new report, Human Rights Watch makes a broader accusation that the Israeli government itself practices apartheid and persecution.
When we started looking at it, we saw a reality in which a single government rules over the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, where roughly 6.8 million Jewish Israelis and 6.8 million Palestinians live. And across these areas, Israeli authorities systematically repress Palestinians and methodically privilege Jewish Israelis.
The report focuses on 4 arenas. In Israel, where it says Palestinian Israeli citizens are discriminated against, particularly in terms of land use. In the occupied West Bank, where Palestinians, unlike Israeli settlers, are subject to military law, and where settlers have preferential access to land, resources and building permits. In Hamas-controlled Gaza, from which Palestinians are barred exit to live in the West Bank or East Jerusalem, and in occupied East Jerusalem, where, unlike Israeli citizens, Palestinians can have their residency status revoked. This is the second high-profile report this year that has accused Israel of practicing apartheid. In January, the Israeli rights group B'Tselem said the Israeli government was enacting Jewish supremacist policies in the occupied Palestinian territories and inside Israel itself. Israel is again rejecting such charges, its foreign ministry saying Human Rights Watch is known to have a long-standing anti-Israeli agenda, actively seeking for years to promote boycotts against Israel. Their decision not to share this report for review or comment with any Israeli authority is clear indication that it is a propaganda pamphlet which lacks all credibility. But critics point to the 2018 nation-state law, which defined national self-determination as, quote, unique to the Jewish people, and to the fact for several months last year, Israel's Prime Minister was advocating the permanent annexation of nearly a third of the occupied West Bank.
This is a very important report on Israel practicing apartheid policies. This should be the position of the international community, as it was with South Africa, and there should be punishment against the occupation.
Human Rights Watch says with no viable peace process in place, the situation has gone from temporary occupation to permanent domination. It's calling on the International Criminal Court to investigate its allegations. Harry Fawcett, Al Jazeera, occupied East Jerusalem.
All right, let's bring in our guests in Gaza. Raji Sourani, a human rights lawyer and director of the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. In West Jerusalem, Ann Herzberg, legal advisor to NGO Monitor, a non-governmental organization that analyzes the output of the international NGO community from a pro-Israel perspective. And in London, William Schabas, professor of international law at Middlesex University. Welcome to the program. Raji, let me start with you today. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has welcomed the Human Rights Watch report. He said in a statement that it's urgent for the international community to intervene. Do Palestinians feel that this will lead to any kind of change?
Yes, indeed. I want to say since 20 years, since the having the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, more than 1,200 international organizations across the globe said Israel is a new brand of apartheid. So this is not something really new for us as Palestinians or international human rights organizations. But 3 months ago, B'Tselem issued, which is, one of the leading human rights organizations in Israel, a report stated in a clear-cut way that Israel is a new brand of apartheid, and it is apartheid system. And now Human Rights Watch, which is one of the international leading human rights organizations, confirming as well that we are having in the occupied territories in Israel a state of apartheid. This is one of the most flagrant situation, where apartheid is practiced, and all the Israeli practices in the occupied Palestinian territories and inside Israel shows in a clear-cut way this is a new brand of apartheid practiced in this part of the world. Of course, we seeked and asked all international human rights organizations to have same position, world civil society having the same position, but most importantly, governments as well to respect this fact and try to change it. World having big shame of keeping this new brand of apartheid practice in the 21st century. Now, when we went to the ICC, one of our submissions
Raji, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but let me get back to you on that point about the ICC in just a couple of moments. Let me go over to Anne right now. Anne, in the context of this new report from Human Rights Watch, just how explosive is the use of the term apartheid, and how seriously does the Israeli government take the accusations?
Well, I actually think it's quite interesting that Mr. Sourani raised the Durban Conference, because in 2001, this campaign did begin at the UN Durban Conference. It revived the hateful canard that was repealed by the UN in 1991, that Zionism was racism, and a group of organizations, including Mr. Sourani's and Human Rights Watch, decided to revive this hateful canard and accuse Israel of being an apartheid state. And this campaign, which again he quite clearly acknowledged as a political campaign aimed at denigrating the legitimacy of Israel itself as a homeland, a safe haven for the Jewish people, has been going on since then. Now, the charge of apartheid is quite offensive. There's been no other context outside of South Africa. And by calling Israel an apartheid state, that precisely what is the remedy that they're seeking? They're seeking to eliminate that state. So again, it's quite clear that the goals are hateful. And I would assume that the government would they know that it's a political campaign and that this is just propaganda. But it's important to take note of the depths to which many of these organizations, that although they claim they're promoting human rights, are actually working against human rights.
William, how significant is this new report from Human Rights Watch? And from a legal perspective, does the report, in your opinion, make a solid case that it is an apartheid that is going on?
Well, it's not the first allegation that the crime against humanity of apartheid was being committed by Israel or by Israelis. As has been pointed out, that was done by a major Israeli NGO earlier in the year, and the allegation has been made in the past as well in a report prepared by Richard Falk for the United Nations some years ago. But Human Rights Watch is a very prestigious international non-governmental organization, and it doesn't make a charge like this lightly. It takes it very seriously. I've looked at the report. I find the legal arguments are well set out. They apply the international legal definitions. This is not a piece of propaganda. This is an analysis that's finally rooted in the claim what apartheid is all about is about a violation of the right of equality. And it's about people being treated unequally. And the evidence that Human Rights Watch sets out, the report is more than 200 pages long, documents many examples, both inside the occupied territories and inside Israel proper, of discriminatory treatment of Palestinians. And the definition of apartheid requires that there be an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression. It's a crime before the International Criminal Court. So I think the case is set out. Let's get it before a judge. Let's let judges decide this.
Raji, a few minutes ago, you started to mention the International Criminal Court. Of course, the International Criminal Court has opened a formal investigation into alleged war crimes in the Palestinian territories. Do you believe that this new report is going to factor into the investigation in any meaningful way?
When the ICC prosecutor opened the investigation, and they began to do the preliminary examination, we submitted one of our submissions as Palestinian human rights organizations, as lawyers who represent the victims, as independent professional human rights organization. One of these submissions were precisely on crimes against humanity and persecution, and it was entirely focused on the apartheid, and it was entirely focused on the blockade of the Gaza Strip and the settlement and road system in the West Bank, and how Palestinians are treated in the occupied Palestinian territories by the State of Israel. And it was simply to state very solid facts we are having in the occupied territories, where we are having it on our skin and living it on day-to-day basis, and with the recognized legal standards for apartheid, persecution, and the crimes against humanity. And our submission concluded in simple way that we do have crimes against humanity and apartheid in this part of the world. So that's why we are continuing with this line, and we represented to the preliminary examination as the human rights organizations one precise submission on this regard. And I think this is one of the things that ICC is going to look at now when they open the investigation. So we will have all the evidence, we will have all the files, we are having all the crimes which provide our argument, and we have the standards. By the way, persecution, crimes against humanity, genuine part of the ICC mandate Rome Statute.
And the fact that this report comes not too long after the decision that there will be an investigation by the ICC, is that causing concern among Israeli officials? I mean, I know that Israel has said that it's not going to cooperate with ICC's investigation, but is this causing some amount of concern?
I mean, it's clear that this report and the B'Tselem report that was referenced before are part of a program, unfortunately funded by many European governments, where several of the NGOs that they provide money to have decided as part of a coordinated campaign to issue reports making this offensive allegation. And I'm sure their objective is to see if they can influence the International Criminal Court. I think if anyone looking at these reports in an objective way would certainly not consider them to be well-sourced or well-founded. I doubt Professor Schabas would accept such writings from his students when you actually look at how much of the evidence has been twisted and manipulated. A lot of the claims are completely false. HRW completely glosses over the rich ethnic diversity within Israel and calls all Muslims Palestinians without recognizing the different communities there are: Bedouins, Druze, Cherkessim. So from that perspective, it's quite offensive also. So I don't think there's a lot of concern. It's just more of the same propaganda that these organizations have been pushing for many years. And when, as we have done with many of these reports in the past, when you actually examine the details, the claims fall apart quite quickly.
William, in this report, Human Rights Watch says that policymakers should, going forward, shift focus for Israeli-Palestinian peace away from a political solution and more towards a rights-based approach. Is there any chance that we might see that happen?
You know, it's a very interesting question, because we have this mixing of the political and the judicial in this context, and it's always struck me as a fascinating situation. The activity of the International Criminal Court, which is purely judicial, it's directed at individuals who will be prosecuted for certain crimes, the potential that it may have to influence the political developments. There's a very simple political solution to a problem where there is discrimination by Israel in the West Bank, and that's to give the West Bank full independence as a Palestinian state. So one of the solutions to this issue that makes the issue of apartheid evaporate is, in effect, to create, to have a proper autonomous, independent Palestinian state fully exercising the right of self-determination. So that's the issue that presents itself. I think that Israel, Anne was explaining that she says the facts are poorly set out. Well, if it goes before the International Criminal Court, I don't think Israel should be worried about the facts. They're going to have whoever would be charged will have a fair trial. But I wouldn't be dismissive of the concerns and how this changes the game within Israel. The charges the prosecutor's been looking at up to date concern war crimes and are probably limited to a certain number of precise targets, people in the military and perhaps some of them in the political establishment. Once you make a charge of apartheid, it's the whole state that's potentially susceptible to prosecution. And so it's very difficult then within Israel for people who are in a position of authority in the government to decide whether or not they may be subject to prosecution. And I think that ought to be a concern. This really does change the environment in terms of the threat of prosecution to individuals. And many of them may reflect upon this and say, you know, we could treat the Palestinians a little better. We can solve this problem in a simple way by changing the laws that Human Rights Watch has flagged. And if they do that, then they're immune to prosecution. Then they've solved the problem. That's what they have to do.
And I want to talk for a moment about the issue of the COVID-19 vaccine in Israel and in occupied territories. The Palestinians say that as an occupying force, Israel is responsible for assisting them. Israel says that Palestinians are in charge of their health system. I bring this up because there are rights groups that have been highly critical of Israel in this regard, saying that the fact that Israel, while it has this very successful COVID-19 vaccine campaign going on, that the fact that they have not been providing vaccines to Palestinian territories, that is a form, as they say, of medical apartheid. What do you say to that?
Well, just on the factual basis, that charge is false. I mean, Israel has vaccinated hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, both within Israel and outside, in Gaza and the West Bank. They've provided, hundreds of thousands of vaccines. They provided medical assistance. The Palestinian Authority, which is in charge of the healthcare per the Oslo Accords, has actually rejected on many occasions Israeli help and in providing the vaccines. From very early on in the pandemic, the Palestinians decided they wanted to go along with the World Health Organization COVAX program. But nevertheless, Israel has vaccinated all of the Palestinians that enter into Israel every day to work. That was several 100,000 Palestinians. And of course, Palestinians living in Jerusalem are entitled, they are covered under the Israeli healthcare system. And so they also have received vaccines to the same degree in which Israel has received them. So really, under the charges of these rights groups, under the legal paradigm that they're pushing forward, Israel's in compliance with international law and under the provisions of the Oslo Accords, which not only did the Palestinian Authority mutually agree to, it's been guaranteed by the international community, including the UN.
Raji, what do you say? Do you believe that more vaccines should be provided? What do you say these charges from rights groups?
This pandemic is evil and bad. And we as a human being, have to face it, confront it, and to do our best in order to overcome it. And Gaza, like any other place on earth, I mean, we have the vaccine, but why Gaza and the occupied territories are unique? In Gaza, we have this criminal, illegal, inhuman siege for 2 million people for the last 14 years. Gaza suffocated socially, economically, including other things, not the movement of sick people and who are in very critical conditions are unable to move to receive developed medical care, but Israel, through very systematic way and mean, and that's the essence of apartheid, suffocated and destroyed the health system. They didn't allow machines, to come to Gaza in the last 14 years. They didn't allow equipments. They didn't allow quite a lot of medicine. And that's why, the health system in the Gaza Strip almost destroyed. And that's what's unique in having the pandemic in Gaza. When we have with bare hands, and even these vaccines should be authorized by the occupation, not given by the occupation. It's entirely full legal responsibility, according to international law, on the state of occupation to provide these vaccines, to the people under the occupation. But Israel, doesn't pay care about that, and they keep us, with pandemic, fighting with our bare hands. This is a big shame for a state like Israel, to have it. If this vaccine should be authorized, by the occupation, not be given by the occupation, why we are subject to that? Why we have one of the highest percent of those who pass away every day, of our dears and our beloved one, and besides that, of those who have this pandemic. This is reality, this is responsibility of occupation, and this is big shame for the state of Israel as an occupied country to have us with this medical situation. Now, beyond that, even cancer cases, people don't have the radiotherapy for that, and they don't, and the only thing they are having chemotherapy. So cancer patients, also, suffering from that, not only people who suffer from pandemic. The only medical cases can be transferred to receive developed medical care, life-saving cases, which most of them come back to Gaza dead people, because they go in very
Raji,
late stages.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're
very destroyed.
Raji, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are starting to run out of time.
And this is the essence of apartheid.
Thanks. And it looked to me like you might have wanted to jump in there. Please go ahead. We only have about a minute left, so please go ahead.
Sure. I was just surprised in Mr. Sourani's retelling of what's going on in Gaza that he completely ignores the infighting between the Fatah party and Hamas and the political problems going on in the Palestinian Authority, which is largely responsible for the medical problems happening in Gaza. So I think that was quite interesting that he omitted that.
All right, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thank you so much to all of our guests, Ann Herzberg, Raji Sourani, and William Schabas. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see this and all of our previous programs again anytime visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.